Riddle me this. What kind of a man is bats on the brain?
All of us. Okay, fine, I'll use my I statements. I have bats in the brain. Rivaled only by Spider-Man, Batman is the most popular comic book character in terms of multimedia adaptation. One could argue that Superman is in fact the reigning king and godfather of adaptation, who also had a serial origin story in the 1940s and was the first major studio adaptation with Richard Donner's 1978 Superman. Unlike Batman, Superman has struggled connecting with audiences over the decade, deemed a character out of time and out of joint for today's sensibilities. Following the first two installments, Superman largely languished with subpar sequels and spurious spin-offs. Batman, however, from its serial inception in the 1940s all the way to its current incarnation, has maintained a cultural relevancy reserved for few intellectual properties, regardless of comic book origins. So why has Batman been able to accomplish what so few other comic properties seemingly can't? Because Batman is the horror genre of superheroes. He's malleable to the point of self-reflection. And like horror throughout the decades, Batman adaptations say more about us as a culture than they do about its titular character. So where to begin? Batman made his comics debut in May 1939 with an appearance in Detective Comics number 27. He proved an instant hit, and by the spring of 1940, DC launched his own flagship title. It would take only 3 years before Columbia Pictures produced the first on-screen adaptation of Batman with the 1943 serial titled simply Batman. The serial follows Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson, who are secret government agents tasked with stopping a Japanese crime ring from wreaking havoc upon Gotham in a post-Pearl Harbor world. I guess we hadn't dropped the bomb yet, so we were like, fuck it, bats. We might have to cut that joke. It's not a good joke, maybe. J. Carroll Naish played the main antagonist, created explicitly for the film, Dr. Daka, an agent of the Japanese Imperial government. Allegedly, Naish was originally cast to play the Joker before producers decided to rework the plot to have a wartime theme. Posters mocked up in pre-production seemed to corroborate this, which would explain why Daka and the Joker share more than a few character traits. But malleable even in its debut, Batman transforms itself to meet the cultural moment. The Joker is scary, but the Japanese, in this moment in time, were much scarier. It's more or less wartime propaganda, taking iconic characters, or in this instance, creating them, in order to drum up and corral wartime support. The same fate befell Captains Marvel and America respectively. This was popular, and it spawned a post-war sequel called Batman and Robin in 1949, met with less fanfare. And because of this, the cape and cowl would remain unworn for the better part of 2 decades, until Batman 66 is probably the most fascinating entry on this list for a myriad of reasons. For one, its color palette and tone are in direct opposition to the dark, high-contrast look we now come to understand as the Batman aesthetic. Secondly, it largely feels like a film more suited for the memification culture of today, what with shark repellent spray and those dreaded days where you just can't get rid of a bomb.
Holy.
But most interestingly, many directors that would leave their fingerprints on the franchise in the future, whether in comics or films, the Kevin Smiths, the Tim Burtons, and the Chris Nolans of the world, were introduced to this version of the character. A character silly to its core, unabashed in its camp. And based on the creative contribution of all three, a Batman that none had any interest in recreating.
It's Batman!
This version of the character is often ridiculed and looked down upon, but I think it was faithful to its time period and the cultural climate in which it was released. Debuting during the Silver Age of comics, many of the rougher edges of the character had already by this point been sanded off in the comic book counterpart, in response to the Comics Code Authority. But it wasn't without its social commentary. Released during the Vietnam War and the larger Cold War, Batman 66 would mark Batman's first incursion into global politics, albeit with kid gloves.
Have you recently sold any war surplus submarines, and if so, to whom?
Well, just a moment. I'll have to look that up.
But mostly, the film felt like a conscious choice to lean into the absurdity of the Batman premise in general. It reminded me, in a strange way, of that Frankenstein cut of Justice League. Say what you want about the Snyder cut, at least he had the good sense to shroud his heroes in darkness. The Whedon cut, like Batman 66, reveals how inherently silly these heroes are in the sober light of day. So, we decided to put him in the shadows. It's hard to articulate what an atom bomb Batman '89 was to the film industry at the time. Considered one of the true godfathers of the comic book movies of today, big budgeted and boldly singular, Tim Burton's Batman felt like a re-legitimization of the comic book film. It had big production values and bigger stars. Where Superman 78 flew, Batman '89 soared. The film, and its sequel Batman Returns, waded heavily into the darkness and brooding nature of the character and the morally bankrupt society in which it was released. A real, this isn't your grandpa's Batman moment. At its heart, it's just as entrenched in the 80s conformist Reagan-era America critiques as any of Burton's other films. Here, Burton is doing his typical Burton thing, poking at the underbelly of elites and positing that they're just as weird as we are. The Gipper's 80s consumerism made superheroes out of the rich. Here, Burton flips it to expose that they're all freaks too. The Penguin, he's a freak. Walken, I don't even know his character's name, he's a freak. Bruce Wayne is definitely a freak.
I want a freak who just don't care.
Michelle Pfeiffer is a national treasure, you shut your fucking mouth. Its greatest achievement is less its fidelity to the Batman mythos as it is successfully being a Tim Burton film first and a Batman film second, while still staying true to the crux of that character. And then there's these fever dreams masquerading as films. They exude that 90s energy in a way so few films ever could, or would. Both of these films feel like they're screaming, "Slick Willie's in office, we're surplusing over here." Despite the gaudy opulence of the films, it does feel like an honest attempt at trying to readapt Batman 66's tone and sensibility. But at this point, we were firmly in the Happy Meal merchandising era. Cynical consumerism of the 80s just had a better spin team. Every decision felt like it was made for the sole intent of building a temple to cash grabs. I mean, for fuck's sake, Schumacher's Batman has a goddamn Bat credit card?
Never leave the cave without it.
It's a testament to tie-ins, a monument to excess and prosperity where the only option was to go as big and loud and garish as possible because every other stylistic option had been done already. It effectively killed the franchise. And then Batman went into reboots. It would take almost a decade before we received a new Batman film, though it wasn't for lack of trying. After the critical lambasting of Batman and Robin,
I hated this movie.
Warner Brothers threw everything at the wall when developing the next incarnation of their character. A Batman Beyond film was pitched. Batman Year One with Darren Aronofsky attached as director was briefly in production. There is no God. But when all of those projects failed to materialize for one reason or another, Warner Brothers hired Christopher Nolan to direct what would become Batman Begins. If the Schumacher films lean into the comic parts of the comic book source material, Nolan stripped his Batman of anything resembling it, opting instead to draft a Batman from our world. No longer would Gotham City be created in studio sound stages, but instead they would be shot on location in London, Chicago, and Pittsburgh. Real-world sociological and societal issues would find their way into the trilogy. Batman Begins tackles the post-9/11 militarization of the Batmobile and other technologies,
I gotta get me one of those.
as well as fighting a conceptual boogeyman like fear itself, i.e. the War on Terror. The Dark Knight raises Patriot Act-era surveillance state ethical concerns. How they ultimately find Joker and save the day is to infringe on the civil liberties of the citizens of Gotham. The Dark Knight Rises tries and mostly fails to address income inequality and use Occupy Wall Street as a real-world analog for the classist struggles of Gotham citizens. Some of these were executed more successfully than others, but the franchise remains a snapshot of contemporaneous life in the 2000s, a time capsule in Bat form. It was inarguably the watershed moment of the character and the franchise, and it would be followed by arguably its lowest and most confounding. I can already hear the of people shitting on me for not liking the Snyderverse. At the risk of upsetting the Batfleck stands, there are many problems with Snyderverse Batman, but the largest and most damning is that it doesn't feel like a Batman for any time. I don't want to wholesale hate on the Batfleck of it all, by the way. I found him to be good in the role, and I liked the idea of a world-weary and fed-up version of Batman. But that's half an idea, not a concept, and it's one that's been done more successfully by other directors in the franchise. Bruce is in literal rubble for his in-universe equivalent of 9/11. Above all else, Snyder is both preoccupied with the rule of cool over plot cohesion, but also refashioning Batman through a post-9/11 nihilist lens. Other than the costume, he scarcely resembles Batman at all. Snyder's Batman, for example, kills explicitly. He doesn't function to save anything or to make his city better. He is driven solely by a revenge instinct reminiscent of America on September 12th, 2001. He's also a Randian figure, but in a gauzier way. Throughout the story, he's both Howard Rourke, arch-capitalist genius who doesn't need help or personal relationships to succeed, and Gale Wynand, a near-tragic man who could have been, who is haunted by his past and fears the arrival of the purest good, i.e. Superman. It's unfortunate because you end up with this nihilistic, muddled character that's both hero and anti-hero depending on what scene he's in. I'm not sure whether to root for him or to be outraged by him, and I mostly find myself in the latter. What's odd is that Snyder, for all his dark, brooding edgelord energy, actually seems a much better fit for Batman's aesthetic than Superman's optimism. Part of me feels like Snyder just really wanted to make a Batman movie to begin with, and got saddled with soups. He couldn't have what he wanted and didn't like what he had, so in an attempt to have it all, Snyder films seem to have nothing. I know it has its fans out there, and I won't say it isn't singularly his vision, but a vision doesn't make a good film, and the proof is in the pudding, it doesn't make a good Batman. Since this movie is brand new, I feel like I have to walk through a bat minefield here, and I'll do my best not to spoil things. Matt Reeves crafted an unrelentingly dark, oppressively long, yet satisfying and cathartic neo-noir that just kinda happens to star Batman. It feels simultaneously like a comic book movie and almost the declaration of the end of the comic book movie. It uses the death of the omnipotent parent to parallel the impact of losing faith in institutions, how that loss of faith can lead to radicalization or inherent paranoia, and how that can lead to criminal acts being seen as acts of vengeance or cosmic comeuppance. They say everyone is the hero of their own story, but that feels especially true in this film. I spent 2 out of the 3 hours saying, I don't know, I feel like Riddler did nothing wrong. Its straightforward willingness to confront and deconstruct the thin line between heroism and villainy is precisely what makes this film the Batman of our moment. But perhaps the most surprising aspect of the film, and one that easily could have been left out if left in a lesser director's hands, is the portrayal of the Fringe themselves. At no point does it justify or make excuses for their actions, but it shows the alienation of these characters, not sympathetically, but compassionately. It illustrates how found community felt by those admonished by society can feel as if you're not alone. There's a genuine sense of camaraderie, and once again, I don't think this is shown as a means of softening the insidious actions, but rather positing that public ridicule won't change hearts and minds. Instead, it will drive these people to seek validation and kinship within darker and darker circles. It's a post-postmodernist Batman, and it's gonna piss a lot of people off. That's all I'm comfortable saying about this new film for now. I thought I would have to scrounge and look too closely into things to find meaning, but once again, Batman is the hero we deserve, a hero that forces us to confront what we usually choose to ignore. And in the end, are we better for it? Or does the crusade continue on forever?